Hello. Recently I did a presentation at a STEAM meeting in New Zealand with the goal to try and explain what are some of the questions that can be answered by a sterilisation tracking system. So this is that presentation, and I'm just basically giving the cut down version. So what questions can be answered by a sterilisation tracking system, or putting it another way, what's in it for me? So what I'm looking at are what are all the benefits that you will be getting out of a tracking system, and it's not going to be specific to LTrace, it's about any tracking system. So everything that I'm talking about here, you should be able to apply to whatever system you've got. And because that was my goal, as I go through this presentation, there's not going to be any screenshots. So this is not an LTrace presentation, but just about any tracking system. What's the sort of questions you should be able to answer from the system that you've got? Now, I also don't want to be focusing on the use of computers. It's not about what computers do. Instead, it's about what they can do for you. So I want to make you the center of the presentation. Now, before I get started, I just want to talk about a problem with the standards. Well, first of all, apart from the fact that the standards will put you to sleep, what I wanted to do is look at what specifically the standards were trying to achieve. So within the standards, you see procedures should be in place to link sterilizer cycle batch information to items that have been sterilized to the patient. This is intended to answer one question and one question only, and that question is this item safe to use? So at the point of a procedure, a nurse needs to be able to look at any wrapped item and know that it's been sterilised and is safe. It needs to be recorded with each sterilisation load. And so we're familiar with most of it, but the interesting one is G, the specific contents of the load. For example, linen packs, instrument trays, bowls, sets, or whatever. And so the reason why this clause is in the standards is because it's meant to answer one question and one question only, which is, oh no, everything's just gone to pot. Where do I have to go to find these items? And so hopefully by vaguely knowing what those items are, you know where to go searching for it. The only problem is you've got no idea whether or not they're still on the shelves, whether or not they're in a theatre, or if they've been used on a patient. So let's get a little bit smarter, and so this is where we start to introduce the benefits of an electronic system. So the first one is I want to introduce to you the concept of an item. Now, practically for me, an item could be a tray or an individually sterilised item. It really doesn't matter. What I'm saying is we've just got this concept of an item within the system. Okay, so first of all, with a computer system, we can do quick identification or a simple search. So if we've got a barcode on it, we're going to scan that barcode, and otherwise we've got simple text searches or whatever the case may be. And so the benefit of that is if I can quickly identify an item, I can quickly bring it up on a screen in front of you. And so now we can start to answer some really, really helpful questions. First of all, what is this? So for example, if I scanned a barcode, I've now got the exact item in front of me. So I don't have to guess what it is. I know what it is. It's going to tell me exactly which item it is. You can start to have photos. And so what does it look like? What does it look like disassembled? What does it look like assembled? So those sort of questions are really, really helpful for as you're doing the pack and making sure that you have prepared the item correctly. What did it look like is a really useful question, especially when you start talking about loan sets. So what did it look like when we received it? So what is it meant to look like when we return it? How do I process this item? What am I meant to do? So if you've got a new item, if you've got a complex item, or if you've got a turnover in staff where you want to make sure that all your staff know exactly what to do, the system can tell you exactly how to process this item. And depending on the system you've got, that may be text, it may be documents, it may be images, it may be video, but you can start to put in instructions as to how to process any item. What instruments are in this tray? Now that's your count sheet. So rather than having to maintain a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever, it can all be centrally controlled and easily updated. So what instruments are in this tray? And you can print that out immediately. Is there anything special I need to know? So this is now looking at your CSSD procedures, but it could also be your theatre procedures. So as someone's opening up an item in theatre, you can be telling them something specific that they need to be aware of. So it's not just in CSSD, it's all through the hospital. So my big point here is if you've got a good tracking system, it should be moving you away from just focusing on the tracking system and allowing you to actually get on and do the job properly. Items do we own? That's really important for purchasing and helping them to know what assets there are, what additional assets you need. So that's just purely having a concept of an item within a database or computer system. Now let's take it one step further. Let's make a printed label. So what we're doing now is moving away from that handwritten label and going to a printed label. And really at this stage what I'd have to say is it's chalk and cheese. The difference that it makes is absolutely huge, and here's some of the differences. First of all, what is this? So you've got rid of that handwritten label that can't be read in some cases, and so now you've got a clearly marked legible label so everyone knows what is this item without actually having to open it. You can put the location where it's meant to be stored. So where do I store this item? And it means that you can have less experienced staff knowing exactly where something's meant to go. And that saves a huge amount of time searching for an item that's been put in the wrong location. Is there anything special I need to know before I open it? So we can print a label to say that there's an item missing, or clarifying exactly what's in it so that theatre staff aren't opening it just to discover that the critical instrument is missing, it's not suitable for what they need to do. So is there anything special I need to know before I open it? Now let's introduce the concept of a sterilisation load. So now we can answer questions like how many loads have we done, which is fantastic for your annual, your monthly reporting. How many failed loads have we had? What test loads have we done? And so at this stage, most of those just help the manager, but really it's just taking those results and putting them in a computer so you can quickly know what's going on. But now let's start to get slightly fancier. So let's combine data from two different sections. So let's combine sterilisation loads with the actual item. And so for any item, since it's linked to the load, we can start to ask questions like, when was this item sterilised? And that's really good for use by information. And getting back to the most critical question of all, is this item safe to use? So we've got the item, we know when it was sterilised. If it wasn't, we can warn. How often has this item been sterilised? And that's really good for your limited use items. But now, if we look at the data the other way around, what you start to discover is there's a lot more questions. And if you're in my presentation, you would have had a really cool card game, but you're not, so you missed it. So what I'm going to do is now look the other way around. So we're going to look from the sterilisation load back to the item. And so now we know all the items associated with the load, so we can now ask which items were sterilised in this load. And that's really good for infection control recalls, reports on utilisation, your financial costing. And at the same time, we've now got rid of the need of writing down all of this information. And so the time saving in this is absolutely huge. Now I want to introduce the concept of a patient. So now, which patients used items from this load? Fantastic for infection control. and it's really good for recalls. So the patient used items from this patient used items from which loads, then allows you to start looking at infection control, moving back to the source of a problem. Is there a common load for these patients? Once again, infection control, looking back to the source. Now, if we look at the relationship between an item and a patient, we can start to ask these questions. Which items were used, which patients used this item for infection control and looking for the spread? And then if we reverse it, which items were used by this patient? Once again, infection control, but financial billing information, so you can now be charging a patient a accurate cost of a procedure, and looking at the true cost for procedures. Now let's have a look at what happens when we incorporate the wash load with our tracking system. When and where was this item washed? Which is fantastic for infection control. And one could actually argue that the wash cycle is probably more important than the sterilisation cycle. The logic behind that is you can't sterilise a dirty item. So if it hasn't been washed effectively, it doesn't matter what you're going to do through the sterilisation, you need to make sure that it's been properly washed first. So when and where was this item washed? Infection control. Going back the other way, if you did have a wash load that's failed, which items were washed in this load? And that's critical for doing recalls. If you're looking at pre-wash loads to the patient, you can start to ask questions like, which patients used these items from this load? Once again, recalls and infection control. You can also then turn around and have a look at the patient used items from which loads, infection controls, looking at the source, infection control, looking at the spread. And then, is there a common load for these patients? Now let's have a look, once we have a look at the wash load after an item's been used. And at this stage, you'll notice that the wash load before, the sterilisation, linking it to the patient, and then the wash load after is basically a complete cycle within the sterilisation of an item. So we can have a look at the patient to the wash load after, and so in which loads did this patient's items get washed, and that becomes really handy. Missing instruments, so you can tell whereabouts all the wash loads that you need to be looking at if you want to be trying to track down a missing pair of scissors or whatever the case may be. Turning it around, this load contained items from which patients, and that's helpful for the identification of stray items. So if you do have a tray and it's got an extra pair of scissors, you can start to work out potentially which set did it actually come from. Now let's introduce the concept of a location. So what we're going to do here is, as the sterilised items move throughout the facility, we're going to be scanning them into a storeroom or scan them into a theatre, scan them back into CSSD. So now linking the item information with the location answers one huge question, and this one for a lot of people using a tracking system is probably the biggest feature. Where is this item? So you're in the middle of the procedure and you need to find an extra tray, and so straight away jump onto the system. It will tell you exactly where it is. So it'll tell you whether or not it's in the storeroom, whether or not it's in theatre, CSSD. And so don't bother ringing up CSSD when you know that there's one on the shelf. Just head out, grab it off the shelf. Alternatively, don't bother heading out to the storeroom when you know there's nothing there. Contact CSSD and get them to fast track something. What items are at this location is your classic question for stock take, and so you can tell what's in an area and then confirm that. Where was this item sterilised or used is fantastic questions. And then if we go around the other way, which items were used in this theatre? Infection control. Which items were sterilised in this facility? Fantastic for reporting. And which items were sterilised for this customer is a great one for your financial billing system. And so we've got customers who will actually charge their customers based on what's being scanned out to them. Now, if we introduce the concept of the previous patient, then what we can start to do is actually look at the relationship between patients. So which patients used this item before this patient? Once again, infection control. And then afterwards, introducing which patient used it next, which patients used it after this patient. And this is once again your infection control and looking but this is really what I've been building up to, is a much more complex. Let's have a look at what's happening when you combine data from a number of tables. So in this case, let's have a look at sterilisation loads, patients, items, and location. And I've mentioned this a number of times so far, but let's bring them all together. Where are the items that were sterilised in this load? So you've got a sterilisation load, you've got a problem. Whereabouts are they? Which patients use them? And the great thing about an infection control system is that you can tell instantly all the items that were sterilised in a particular load, whereabouts are they, and which patients have used them. And so you can instantly do a recall, you can pass that information on to infection control, and they can be monitoring specific patients. It's all there at the click of a button. If we then look at previous patient, next patient, what items were used on this patient, who used it next, or who used it prior, infection control, but in the case of CJD, that's the information you need. Who's the patient that's likely to have been the source, or more often than not, which patients use the instrument afterwards that you then need to be monitoring. So, could we have got all of this information manually? And I would argue no. It's a huge amount of work, and in many cases I'd say it's totally impractical, if not impossible. But can you do it with a tracking system? And the answer is with the click of a button. So that's basically it. They're the questions that I say can be answered very quickly and easily using a tracking system. And they're not just hypothetical questions, they're all practical questions that will help you do your job. So thanks a lot for watching this presentation, and I hope you found it helpful. Thank you. Bye.